The crisp, white collar of the manager's shirt seemed to tighten around his thick neck, a visible measure of his rising indignation. "I asked you a question, Leo," Marcus Thorne said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with unearned authority. He snapped his fingers, a gesture meant to demean, to remind the man in the gray janitorial jumpsuit of his place. "Are you deaf, or just stupid?" Julian Vance stood perfectly still, the mop handle cool and solid in his hands. He kept his eyes fixed on the scuff mark on the marble floor, a dark slash against the pristine white. Inside his chest, his heart hammered a frantic, angry rhythm. He was not Leo, the phantom identity he'd worn for the past 3 months. He was Julian Vance, the founder and CEO of Vance Hospitality, the man who owned this very building, this floor, this air Marcus Thorne breathed so arrogantly. He had to remember why he was here. He had to swallow the fire that licked at the back of his throat. "I heard you, Mr. Thorne," Julian said, his voice deliberately soft, deferential. It was a voice he had perfected, the voice of someone who expected to be overlooked. He didn't look up. Looking up would be a challenge, and he couldn't afford that. "Not yet." "Then answer me," Marcus pressed, stepping closer. The scent of his expensive, cloying cologne filled the space between them. "I have the delegation from Shanghai arriving in less than an hour for the final walkthrough. The board meeting is tomorrow. This deal is worth $200 million. And you are standing here, staring at the floor. Why is there a chemical smell in the lobby?" Julian knew exactly why. The new cleaning solution, the one Marcus had insisted on purchasing to cut costs by a pathetic 3%, was reacting poorly with the sealant on the Italian marble. Julian had filed an anonymous report about it 2 weeks ago, a detailed chemical analysis typed up on an old library computer and slipped under the head of operations door. A report that had clearly been ignored. Or, more likely, thrown away by Marcus himself. "I believe it's the new solvent, sir," Julian said, keeping his tone neutral. "It might be causing a reaction." Marcus scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound. "A reaction? Are you a chemist now, Leo? You push a mop. That's what you do. You're not paid to think. You're paid to clean. Now get rid of that smell before my investors arrive, or you'll be cleaning toilets on the street." He punctuated the threat with a sharp poke to Julian's shoulder. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure fury that nearly shattered his composure. It took every ounce of his discipline, every memory of his father's quiet strength, not to grab Marcus's wrist and break it. Instead, he clenched his jaw so tightly he felt a muscle jump near his temple. He gave a short, clipped nod. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." As Marcus spun on his heel and marched away, his polished shoes clicking an obnoxious rhythm of self-importance on the floor, Julian allowed himself to look up. He watched the man disappear into his glass-walled office, a petty king in a tiny, transparent castle. The anger was a familiar companion these days, a hot coal in his gut. But beneath it, colder and sharper, was the icy grip of desperation. This was not a game. It was not some corporate experiment in empathy. It was a race against time. He pulled a worn, cracked smartphone from his pocket, the screen a spiderweb of fractures. It was a burner phone, part of his disguise. He tapped the screen, his thumb hovering over his mother's contact photo. He didn't call. He couldn't. He just needed to see her face, her warm, tired smile. The message from her doctor was seared into his brain, each word a brand of hot iron. Aggressive, unresponsive to standard treatment. The experimental surgery is our last, best hope. We need to move now. The window is closing. The surgery cost $1.7 million. It wasn't covered by insurance. It was a sum that would have been trivial to him 4 months ago. A rounding error. A bad day on the stock market. But 4 months ago, his father was still alive, and the company's assets were not frozen in a complicated probate battle initiated by a greedy, distant relative contesting the will. His personal accounts were tied up. His access to the vast Vance fortune was temporarily strangled by red tape and legal maneuvering. The only way to get the money in time was to liquidate a major asset. The sale of this hotel, the pinnacle, the crown jewel of his empire, to the Shanghai consortium was the only path. The deal had to go through. It had to be finalized tomorrow. And it was all in the hands of Marcus Thorne, a man who couldn't tell the difference between a balance sheet and a cleaning solvent. So Julian Vance, the billionaire CEO, became Leo, the invisible maintenance man. He was here to ensure this deal didn't fall apart due to the incompetence he'd suspected was rotting his company from the inside out. He had to protect his father's legacy, not just for the principal, but for the very real life-or-death price tag attached to it. His mother's life was on the line. He took a deep breath, the acrid chemical smell filling his lungs. He had less than 24 hours to save his mother, his company, and his father's dream. And to do it, he had to remain a ghost, a shadow mopping the floors, while a fool wore the crown. This whole undercover mission had been his father's idea, in a way. Thomas Vance had built their hospitality empire on a simple, unshakable belief. A building is only as strong as its foundation. For him, the foundation of any Vance hotel was not the concrete or steel, but the housekeepers, the bellhops, the maintenance crews. The people who saw the truth of the place every single day. You can't see the cracks from the penthouse, Julian, his father had told him, just weeks before the sudden, shocking heart attack that had taken him. They were sitting in Thomas's study, a room that smelled of old books and leather. His father, a man whose presence had always seemed as permanent as a mountain, looked frail, his hands resting on a worn, leather-bound journal. It was his most prized possession. It contained every idea, every blueprint, every hope he'd ever had for the company. The real story isn't in the quarterly reports, Thomas had continued, his voice thin but firm. It's in the break rooms. It's in the whispers in the hallways. If you want to know if your ship is sound, you don't ask the captain on the bridge. You ask the engineer in the boiler room. After his father's death, the words had echoed in Julian's grief-stricken mind. He saw the reports from the Pinnacle, the flagship hotel. Profits were down, staff turnover was astronomical, and guest complaints were subtly, but steadily, rising. The man in charge, Marcus Thorne, was a numbers guy, a hire from outside the company who promised efficiency and modernization. His reports were filled with corporate jargon and slick graphs, but they felt hollow. They didn't tell the real story. Then the will was contested, his assets were frozen, and his mother received her devastating diagnosis. Suddenly, his father's words were no longer a piece of sentimental philosophy. They were a strategic imperative. He needed the Pinnacle to be at its absolute best for this sale. He needed to know what the real problems were, and he needed to fix them without revealing his hand. So he had created Leo. He'd used a contact from his college days, a man who now ran a third-party contracting firm, to get a maintenance job at his own hotel. He'd bought work clothes from a thrift store, a beat-up car for a few $100s, and rented a small, bleak apartment miles away from his empty mansion. He'd even left his father's journal, his own personal touchstone, in the locker assigned to him, carrying the weight of his legacy with him every day. He had thought it would be a straightforward intelligence mission. Identify the problems, find a way to covertly fix them, ensure the sale went through. He hadn't been prepared for the daily, grinding humiliation. He hadn't been prepared for Marcus Thorne. Marcus was more than just incompetent. He was a petty tyrant, a man who derived his sense of worth from the fear and discomfort of others. Julian had watched him for 3 months, his stomach churning with a cold, impotent rage. He saw Marcus publicly berate Maria, a housekeeper who had been with the company for 20 years, for being 30 seconds late back from her break. He'd made her cry in the middle of a busy corridor, her shoulders shaking as he threatened to fire her, knowing full well she was a single mother of 3. Julian, as Leo, had quietly helped her finish her cart later that day, listening as she spoke of her fears, her voice a choked whisper. He saw Marcus take credit for a brilliant cost-saving initiative proposed by a young man in the accounting department, presenting it as his own in a management meeting and then downsizing the young man a week later to remove any trace of the idea's true origin. And he saw how Marcus treated the staff he deemed beneath him, the invisibles. He never made eye contact. He never used their names unless he was barking an order. He saw them as furniture, as tools, as obstacles. This was the rot his father had warned him about. It was a cancer eating away at the soul of the company. Julian went to his maintenance closet, a cramped, windowless room that smelled of grease and disinfectant. The smell in the lobby was his first problem. He couldn't just neutralize it. He had to eliminate the source. He knew from his anonymous research that a simple solution of vinegar and baking soda, circulated through the HVAC intake vents nearest the lobby, would neutralize the acidic compound from the new solvent. It was a low-tech, brilliant fix he'd learned from his very first mentor, his father's head of engineering, a man who could fix a citywide power grid with a paperclip and some wire. He mixed the solution in a large, unlabeled bucket. He didn't have access to the main HVAC controls. That was far above Leo's pay grade. But he knew the building's schematics by heart. He had helped his father design them. He knew about the auxiliary maintenance access panel hidden behind a large potted palm near the west entrance. He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. He felt a grim satisfaction as he poured the solution into the intake. It was a small act of defiance, a secret stroke of competence in a world run by a fool. As he slid the panel back into place, he heard footsteps. It was Maria. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she held her cleaning cart as if it were a shield. "Leo," she whispered, her English accented but clear. "Mr. Thorne, he is very angry today." "He's always angry, Maria," Julian said, his voice softening. "No, this is different," she insisted. "The investors. He is afraid. When he is afraid, he is cruel." She looked at him, her gaze filled with a genuine concern that twisted something in his chest. "Be careful." "I will," he said. "You too." She nodded and hurried away, a ghost in a blue uniform. Her simple, selfless warning was a stark reminder of what was at stake. It was for people like Maria, people who formed the true foundation of his company, that he had to succeed. He was fighting for them as much as he was for his mother. He finished his work and walked back toward the lobby. The harsh chemical smell was already starting to dissipate, replaced by the faint, clean scent of vinegar, which would itself soon fade. He saw Marcus standing by the front desk, yelling at a young bellhop who had apparently failed to polish the brass luggage rack to his satisfaction. Julian slipped past, unnoticed. He was just Leo, the maintenance man. He was invisible. For now, that was his greatest strength. But the clock was ticking, and soon, the whole world would need to see him. The next few hours were a blur of escalating tension. Julian, moving through the hotel's arteries, the service corridors and back stairwells, became a one-man special operations team, covertly fixing the litany of small but significant problems that Marcus's neglect had allowed to fester. He noticed a persistent flickering in the lights of the grand ballroom, where the final presentation for the Shanghai delegation was scheduled to take place. Marcus had dismissed it as a simple bulb issue. Julian knew better. He recognized the specific, rhythmic flicker as a sign of an overloaded circuit breaker, a potential fire hazard, and a guaranteed way to kill a multi-million-dollar presentation. Gaining access to the main electrical room was impossible for Leo, but he knew of a secondary junction box located in a storage closet on the same floor. He spent 20 minutes rerouting the power, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who understood the intricate dance of currents and loads. The lights in the ballroom now shone with a steady, unwavering brilliance. No one would ever know. Next, he overheard a frantic conversation between two concierges. The hotel's high-speed fiber optic connection, a key selling point for business clients, was inexplicably sluggish. The IT department, underfunded and demoralized by Marcus, had no solution. Julian knew that Marcus had recently, in another of his idiotic cost-cutting measures, switched their service provider to a cheaper, less reliable company, but had rerouted the main server through an old coaxial cable hub instead of the proper fiber gateway to save on installation fees. It was a technical blunder of epic proportions. He found his way to the server room in the sub-basement, a place that was supposed to be off-limits. He used a trick his father had taught him. A simple paperclip could bypass most low-level electronic locks. Inside, he found the server set up exactly as he'd feared, a chaotic mess of wires, a testament to Marcus's philosophy of prioritizing cheapness over competence. He couldn't fix the entire system, but he could create a temporary bypass, routing the main connection for the conference rooms directly to the fiber gateway. The hotel's public network would still be slow, but the connection in the ballroom would be lightning fast. He worked in the dim light, the hum of the servers a low thrum in his ears, sweat beading on his forehead. He was just finishing when his burner phone vibrated. It was a text from his aunt. "Doctors called. Your mother had a difficult night. They want to move the surgery up to tomorrow afternoon. They need the funds transferred by noon at the latest." Noon. Tomorrow. The air in the server room suddenly felt thin, suffocating. The timeline had collapsed. He no longer had 24 hours. He had less than 18. The pressure in his chest intensified, a physical weight threatening to crush him. Failure was not an option. It was a death sentence. He made his way back upstairs, his mind racing. Everything now hinged on that meeting. The sale had to be signed. The funds had to be wired. There was no margin for error. As he entered the employee locker room to grab his father's journal for a moment of quiet reflection, he found Marcus Thorne waiting for him. The manager was holding a slim, expensive-looking fountain pen between his thumb and forefinger. This was found near the HVAC access panel in the lobby, Leo, Marcus said, his eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. Funny, isn't it? An $800 Mont-Blanc fountain pen, just lying on the floor where a janitor was working. Julian's blood ran cold. It was his pen. He must have dropped it when he was neutralizing the chemical smell. It had been a gift from his father, one of the few personal items he'd allowed himself to keep on his person. It was a stupid, careless mistake. "I've never seen it before," Julian said, his voice a flat monotone. "Really?" Marcus sneered, stepping closer. "Because I've been watching you, Leo. You don't act like the other grunts. You're too quiet, too observant. And now, I find this," he tapped the pen against his palm. "And I hear from my sources that the ballroom lights are suddenly fixed. And the internet in the conference suite is miraculously working at peak speed. All problems I was told were unsolvable this morning are suddenly solved." Julian remained silent. He could feel the trap closing around him. "You're a clever man, Leo. Too clever for your own good," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't know what your game is. Maybe you're a corporate spy. Maybe you're trying to make me look bad." He leaned in, his foul breath washing over Julian. "But here's what's going to happen. You are going to keep your mouth shut and your head down. And you are going to give me whatever this is." Before Julian could react, Marcus lunged past him and wrenched open his locker. He snatched the worn, leather-bound journal from the top shelf. "What's this?" "Your little diary." Marcus flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the detailed architectural sketches, the complex financial projections, the handwritten notes on personnel management philosophy. It was the heart and soul of Vance Hospitality. It was his father's legacy in his grimy hands. "Give that back," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. The deference was gone, replaced by cold, hard steel. Marcus's eyes lit up with triumph. He had found a lever. "No, I don't think I will. I'm going to hold on to this. And your fancy pen, think of it as collateral, to ensure your good behavior. You do anything to jeopardize my deal tomorrow, and I'll not only have you fired, I'll have you arrested for corporate espionage. I'm sure a look through this little book will give me all the evidence I need." He tucked the journal under his arm and held up the pen. "You will be on duty tomorrow morning. In the ballroom. With your mop. I want you where I can see you. Now get out of my sight." Marcus strode out of the locker room, leaving Julian standing alone, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it felt like it could tear him apart. Marcus hadn't just taken a book. He had taken a piece of his father. He had desecrated a sacred object. And in doing so, he had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. This was no longer just about saving his mother or his company. It was personal. Marcus Thorne had made a grave error. He had pushed a ghost too far, and in doing so, he had just signed his own death warrant. The unmasking tomorrow would not just be a necessity. It would be a pleasure. The morning of the meeting dawned gray and oppressive, the sky over the city the color of slate. Julian hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his tiny apartment, the doctor's words and Marcus's sneering face playing on a loop in his mind. Noon. Collateral. I want you where I can see you. He arrived at the hotel before sunrise, dressed in his now-hated gray jumpsuit. He felt the weight of his father's missing journal like a phantom limb. He saw Maria in the hallway, her face pale with anxiety. She gave him a small, worried nod, and he returned it, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. He was assigned to the ballroom, just as Marcus had commanded. He stood in the back corner with his mop and bucket, a silent sentinel in a room buzzing with anticipation. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. Waitstaff moved silently, placing glasses of water and notepads at each seat. Marcus Thorne swept into the room like a conquering hero. He was wearing a tailored suit that was just a little too tight, a symbol of his inflated ego. He was beaming, preening for the junior executives who trailed in his wake like pilot fish. He caught Julian's eye and gave him a smug, dismissive smirk. He then walked over to the head of the table and placed two items on the polished surface beside his laptop, the Mont Blanc pen and his father's leather journal. He was using them as trophies, as a public display of his power over the lowly janitor in the corner. Julian's gaze locked onto the journal. He could see the frayed edges, the worn spine, the faint indentation of his father's hand on the cover. A wave of protective fury washed over him, so intense it made him dizzy. He gripped the mop handle until his fingers ached, anchoring himself to the present. Patience. Just a little longer. The delegation from the Shanghai-based Tianlong Corporation arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. They were led by a man in his late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an impeccably tailored suit. This was Mr. Chun, the patriarch and chairman, a legendary figure in international business known for his sharp mind and his intolerance for foolishness. His team was a collection of keen-eyed men and women, their faces impassive but their minds clearly working, absorbing every detail of the room, the staff, the atmosphere. Marcus greeted them with an overly effusive welcome, his Mandarin clumsy and poorly accented. Julian winced. Mr. Chun responded with a brief, polite nod and a sentence in flawless English, a subtle power play that seemed to go right over Marcus's head. The meeting began. Marcus launched into his presentation, a slick production of cherry-picked data and misleading projections. He spoke of increased efficiency, of streamlined operations, of a bright and profitable future. He was a master of corporate doublespeak, weaving a narrative that was technically true in its individual components, but utterly false in its overall conclusion. He presented the solutions to the ballroom's lighting and the conference suite's internet as his own personal triumphs. I identified key infrastructural weaknesses and personally spearheaded the initiatives to correct them overnight, he boasted, gesturing grandly. It's this kind of hands-on, proactive management that defines the pinnacle's success. Julian stood in the corner, his presence so negligible that no one even glanced his way. He was a piece of the room's furniture, and from his vantage point, he saw everything. He saw the subtle, skeptical frown on Mr. Chen's face. He saw the way the younger members of the delegation exchanged fleeting, unimpressed glances. They weren't buying it. They were too smart, too experienced. They were looking for the cracks in the facade, and Marcus Thorne was a walking, talking hairline fracture. The presentation dragged on. Marcus was now deep in the financial projections, using figures that Julian knew were based on unsustainable cost-cutting measures, not genuine growth. He was selling them a hollow shell. Finally, Mr. Chun held up a hand. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Your numbers are ambitious. The word hung in the air, weighted with unspoken doubt. I have a question. It concerns your proposed integration of our proprietary guest management software. You claim it will be a seamless transition, but your current server infrastructure, as detailed on page 42 of your report, seems inadequate. Specifically, how do you intend to handle the multi-threaded data processing for real-time translation services without creating a system-wide latency issue? Your report is vague on this crucial technical point. Marcus froze. His confident smile faltered. It was a highly specific, deeply technical question. It was the kind of question a CEO should be able to answer, but a mid-level manager who only read the executive summaries would be completely lost. Well, Mr. Chun, Marcus began, stalling, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an answer written on the walls. Our IT team, they are top-notch. The synergy of the platforms will be maximized through proactive implementation strategies. It was a meaningless string of buzzwords, and everyone knew it. Mr. Chen's expression hardened. He turned to his lead technician and spoke in rapid, fluent Mandarin. Julian, who had spent 5 years in Vance Hospitality's Shanghai office and was fluent himself, understood every word. He has no idea what he is talking about, Mr. Chen said to his subordinate. This man is a fool. He presents us with a glossy brochure, but cannot explain how the engine works. Ask him about the secondary power redundancy protocols for the main server. The technician nodded and addressed Marcus in Mandarin, asking the question as instructed. A look of sheer panic flashed across Marcus's face. He didn't speak the language beyond a few pleasantries. He was completely, humiliatingly exposed. He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. I'm sorry, my Mandarin is a little rusty. Could you repeat that in English? Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair, his disappointment palpable. The deal was collapsing. The $200 million lifeline for his mother's surgery was evaporating before his very eyes. This was the moment, the point of no return. From the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke, the words clear and calm. The voice spoke in perfect, unaccented Mandarin. He is asking about the server's power redundancy. The current system runs on a single-phase backup generator with a 5-second delay, which is completely inadequate and risks total data loss during a switchover. The system requires a dedicated, uninterruptible power supply with parallel redundancy, a solution that could be implemented within 48 hours for a cost of approximately $75,000. Every head in the room swiveled toward the back corner. They stared, dumbfounded, at the janitor standing by the wall, mop in hand. Marcus Thorne's face went from pale to ghostly white. Leo, what do you think you're doing? Be quiet, he hissed in English. Julian ignored him. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Mr. Chen. He continued in Mandarin, his voice gaining strength and authority with every word. Mr. Chen, the man who stands before you knows nothing of this hotel's operations. The numbers he has presented are a fantasy, built on firing loyal employees and cutting corners on critical maintenance. The solutions he claimed as his own were implemented by others. He is not a leader. He is a parasite, draining the life from a great institution. Mr. Chen stared at Julian, his eyes wide with astonishment, not just at the words, but at the sheer audacity of the man speaking them. He looked from the janitor to the sputtering manager and back again. A flicker of understanding, of dawning realization, crossed his face. Who are you? Mr. Chen asked in English, his voice filled with awe. Julian dropped the mop. It clattered loudly on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the stunned silence of the room. He walked forward, his posture changing, his shoulders straightening. The timid deference of Leo the janitor sloughed away, revealing the unshakable confidence of the man who owned the room. He stopped at the head of the table, directly opposite Marcus, who looked as if he was about to faint. My name, he said, his voice now a clear, commanding baritone that resonated with power, is Julian Vance. He reached out and picked up the Mont-Blanc pen, turning it over in his fingers. This was a gift from my father, Thomas Vance, the man who built this company. Then, he gently picked up the leather-bound journal. He held it up for all to see. And this is his playbook. It is the foundation of everything we are. It is the soul of Vance hospitality. He turned his cool, piercing gaze on Marcus Thorne. A soul, I'm afraid, that you know nothing about. A collective gasp went through the room. The junior executives stared, their mouths agape. Marcus Thorne looked like he had been struck by lightning, his body rigid with shock and terror. That's impossible, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. You're a janitor. I hired you. I have your file. You have the file of a ghost, Marcus, Julian replied, his voice dangerously calm. A persona I created to see the truth of my own company. To find the rot my father warned me about, he gestured around the room. And I found it. It's standing right here, in a suit it doesn't deserve. Mr. Chen, who had been watching this unfold with the intensity of a chess grandmaster, finally spoke. Mr. Vance, he said, the name spoken with newfound respect. This is highly unorthodox. Unorthodox times call for unorthodox measures, Mr. Chen, Julian said, turning to face him. He gave a slight, formal bow. I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary. I could not, in good conscience, sell you a company that was being mismanaged into the ground. I could not sell you a lie. He opened his wallet and pulled out his driver's license and his black corporate credit card, both bearing the name Julian T. Vance. He placed them on the table. My CFO, Rebecca Finch, is on standby. We can video conference her in right now to confirm my identity, along with my corporate counsel. But Mr. Chen simply shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. That will not be necessary. I met your father once, many years ago. I see his fire in your eyes. He looked at Marcus with utter contempt. And I know a fool when I see one. The finality in the investor's tone was absolute. The judgment had been rendered. Julian turned his full attention back to Marcus. The man was trembling now, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. "You took credit for my work," Julian said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You terrorized my staff. You put this entire deal, the legacy of my father, and the future of this company at risk for your own pathetic ego." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And you stole my father's journal." He leaned forward, his voice a low, brutal command. "You are fired." Marcus just stared, speechless. "Your access to all company systems is terminated, effective immediately," Julian continued, the words like hammer blows. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to you, minus the cost of the damages your incompetence has caused. You will be escorted from this property by security, and you will never set foot in another Vance hospitality establishment again." He pressed a small, discreet button under the conference table, a silent alarm that went directly to the head of security. "And if I ever hear of you working in the hospitality industry again," Julian added, his voice lethal, "I will personally call the CEO of whatever company is foolish enough to hire you and tell them this story. You are finished, Marcus. Do you understand me?" Marcus finally found his voice, a desperate, pleading whine. "Please, Mr. Vance. I didn't know." "That's the problem." Julian cut him off coldly. "You didn't know? You didn't care to know. You saw people as objects, as rungs on a ladder for you to climb. But you forgot that some rungs break." Two large security guards entered the room, their movements swift and professional. They flanked Marcus, their presence imposing and non-negotiable. "This man is trespassing," Julian said to them. "Please remove him from the premises." The guards each took one of Marcus's arms. The fight drained out of him instantly. He was no longer a petty tyrant. He was just a small, terrified man, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. As they led him away, his gaze fell on the janitor's mop, still lying on the floor. It was the last thing he saw before the doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. The room was silent for a long moment. The remaining executives looked at Julian with a mixture of fear and awe. Julian took a deep breath, the first clean, easy breath he'd taken in months. He felt the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of release. He had done it. He turned back to the delegation. "Mr. Chun, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Julian Vance, and I am the CEO of this company. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to tell you the truth about the Pinnacle Hotel. And then, I would like to sell it to you." Mr. Chin's smile widened. He stood up and extended his hand across the table. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice booming with renewed enthusiasm, "I think we have a great deal to discuss." The deal was not just saved, it was transformed. With Julian now at the helm, speaking with transparency and a deep, granular knowledge of the hotel's true strengths and weaknesses, Mr. Chin's confidence soared. The negotiations, which had been fraught with doubt, became a collaborative planning session. Julian laid out his real vision, the one his father had instilled in him. He explained how the hotel's foundation, its loyal, experienced staff, was its greatest asset, an asset Marcus had foolishly squandered. He detailed a plan for reinvestment in both infrastructure and personnel, showing Mr. Chin not a hollowed-out property, but one with immense, untapped potential. By 11 o'clock, they had a new agreement. Mr. Chin, impressed by Julian's integrity and vision, not only agreed to the original $200 million price, but added a $50 million bonus, earmarked for capital improvements and employee development programs to be overseen by Julian himself during a one-year transition period. "You have honored your father's legacy today, Mr. Vance," Mr. Chin said as he signed the final documents. "And you have earned a partner, not just a buyer." At 11:45, with the signed contract secured, Julian excused himself. He walked calmly out of the ballroom, pulled out his personal phone, his real phone, and made a call. "Rebecca," he said, his voice steady. "The deal is done. $250 million. I need you to authorize an immediate wire transfer of $1.7 million from the initial deposit to the account for St. Jude's Medical Center. Reference number 86753. For the surgery of Eleanor Vance." There was a pause on the other end, and then the choked, relieved voice of his CFO. "Julian. Oh, thank God. It's done. I'll transfer it this second. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll be in the office this afternoon. We have a lot of work to do." He hung up. A single text message came through moments later. Transfer complete. Julian leaned against the wall in the quiet corridor, the same corridor where he had seen Marcus make Maria cry, and closed his eyes. It was over. The ticking clock had been silenced. His mother was safe. The weight that had been compressing his soul for months finally lifted, and he felt a profound, bone-deep sense of relief that was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. He took a moment to compose himself, then straightened his shoulders. The first battle was won, but the war for the soul of his company was just beginning. He walked back into the ballroom. He was still wearing the gray janitorial jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the powerful executives who now looked to him for leadership. He picked up his father's journal from the table, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the assembled group, including his own stunned junior executives, "please excuse me. I have some people I need to speak with." He left the ballroom and walked directly to the housekeeping department. He found Maria in the linen closet, quietly sorting towels, her face etched with worry. She saw him and her eyes widened in fear, assuming he was about to be fired because of the commotion. "Leo? I mean, sir," she stammered, unsure what to call him. "Julian," he said gently. "My name is Julian, and you can call me Julian." He stepped closer. "Maria, I wanted to come here personally to tell you that Marcus Thorne is no longer with this company. He has been terminated, effective immediately." Maria stared at him, her hands frozen on a stack of towels. "Terminated?" she whispered. "Yes," Julian confirmed. "And I want to apologize. I saw what he did to you. I saw how he treated you and the other staff. It was unacceptable, and I am deeply sorry that I allowed a man like that to be in a position of power in my company." Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of shock, of relief. "But who are you?" "I am Thomas Vance's son," he said simply. "And I'm here to make things right." He paused. "I've reviewed the employee files. You have been with us for 20 years. Your performance reviews, before Marcus took over, were exemplary. You know this hotel better than anyone. Effective immediately, I am promoting you to executive head of housekeeping. You will report directly to me. We are going to rebuild this department based on your experience and your leadership." Maria was speechless. She simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Go home for the rest of the day, Maria," Julian said with a warm smile. "Spend time with your children. Your new salary and position will be reflected in your next paycheck. We'll talk more tomorrow." He left her there, in the quiet, linen-scented closet, and went in search of others. He found the young accountant who Marcus had fired after stealing his idea and rehired him on the spot, promoting him to a senior analyst position. He went to the IT department, the engineering crew, the bellhops, introducing himself, apologizing for the failures of the previous management, and promising a new era of respect and investment. He was not just a CEO handing down orders from on high. He was a man in a janitor's uniform, speaking to them on their level, promising them the dignity they had long been denied. Word spread through the hotel like wildfire. The ghost in the gray jumpsuit was the owner. The quiet man who fixed things no one else could was the CEO. The tyrant was gone. A palpable sense of hope, of cautious optimism, began to ripple through the staff. The foundation his father had spoken of was broken, but not shattered. It could be repaired. It would be rebuilt, stronger than before. 3 months later, Julian Vance stood by the panoramic window of his new office. It was not the opulent penthouse suite his predecessor had used, but a more modest, functional space on a middle floor, with a large glass wall that looked out over the city. On his polished oak desk, his father's leather journal lay open, its pages filled with the wisdom of the past and the plans for the future. He was no longer in a jumpsuit. He wore a simple but well-tailored dark suit, a uniform of a different kind. The sale of the Pinnacle to the Tianlong Corporation had been a resounding success. The partnership was flourishing, and the influx of capital had revitalized the hotel. More importantly, the culture had been transformed. Julian had spent the last 90 days implementing sweeping changes across Vance Hospitality, starting with the Pinnacle. His first and most celebrated initiative was the Vance Valor program, a system designed to identify and cultivate talent from within the company's lowest-paid ranks. It offered scholarships, mentorship programs, and clear pathways for advancement for housekeepers, maintenance staff, and kitchen workers who showed promise and dedication. It was his father's philosophy codified into company policy. The engineers in the boiler room would now have a voice on the bridge. Maria, now the head of housekeeping, was thriving. She had revolutionized the department, improving efficiency not by cutting costs, but by investing in her team, providing better equipment, more reasonable workloads, and a culture of mutual respect. Staff turnover had plummeted to near zero, and guest satisfaction scores for cleanliness had reached an all-time high. The young accountant he had rehired had already identified millions in potential savings by exposing the flaws in Marcus's old models and was now leading a team of his own. The hotel was humming with a new energy, the energy of a staff that felt seen, valued, and respected. Julian's mother's surgery had been a complete success. She was now recovering in a sunlit room in his home, her strength returning day by day. The shadow of fear that had haunted him was gone, replaced by the quiet joy of her presence. He had saved his family, and in doing so, he had saved his family's legacy. His phone buzzed with a message from his head of security. It was a quarterly update he had requested. The subject line was simple. Marcus Thorne. Julian opened it. The report was brief. After being blacklisted from every major hotel chain in the country, Thorne had been unable to find work in management. His hubris and lack of actual skills had left him unemployable in the field he'd lorded over. The last known sighting had him working as a night shift security guard for a used car lot on the outskirts of the city. A petty tyrant, now guarding a kingdom of broken-down sedans and rusting pickup trucks. A fitting end. Julian closed the message, feeling not a sense of vengeance, but of grim closure. Marcus was a cautionary tale, a symbol of the rot he had excised. He looked back at his father's journal. He had added his own entries now, detailing the changes he had made, the people he had empowered. He was no longer just the inheritor of a legacy. He was its steward, its active architect. He knew the work was far from over. There would be other challenges, other threats. But he would face them not from a penthouse, but from the ground up. He would remember the lessons he learned in a gray jumpsuit, with a mop in his hand. He would remember the feel of being invisible. And he would spend the rest of his career making sure that no one in his company ever felt that way again.